Alright guys, in today's video we're taking a look at this plug burning problem. This is the Vortec 5.3 liter engine, RPO LC9. This particular one is the aluminum block, but there's a bunch of these different RPO engines that have this problem. And this plug here on number 1, as you can see if we zoom in here, significant oil burning, oil fouling damage. The ceramic has cracked off and resulted in a P301. This truck also has a P307 and a P300, and it's all from a similar problem like this. I've showed you previous videos on this same particular Chevrolet Avalanche with this engine, and I'll put one of those up here in the upper right. But you can either continue to feed it plugs, or you can try to get out of this problem of the oil burning. Now this particular one, what we're starting to see as the mileage gets up is the owner's noticing that the misfires and the plug damage is going beyond just the AFM cylinders. So I'm going to show you a service bulletin from GM about this problem. It was last updated in December of 2014. It covers all of these GMT 900 type vehicles, as well as a few others like the Colorado and the Camaro, all the ones that had these engines, the aluminum blocks, V8s with AFM. So LH9, L94, right, all of these. This particular one's an LC9, but it also affected the iron blocks that had AFM, LMG, and LY5. And they go through talking about that excessive oil consumption, as far as GM's concerned, is more than 1 quart between 2,000 and 3,000 miles of driving. And if you have more than that, then that's what they consider to be a problem. And another symptom of what this bulletin's about is exactly what we're dealing with here: increased oil consumption and cracked or fouled spark plugs on cylinders 1 and 7. Now we have more than that going on that I'll show you in just a moment, but they're pointing out what could be the issue. Now in the previous video I've talked about some of these upgrades that you can do on these engines. One of them being, if it's built before a certain date, you really should have upgraded the driver's side valve cover. That's for engines built prior to February 1st, 2011. And then there's another upgrade in here regarding a splash shield that should be installed over an AFM valve sitting in the oil pan area. And the year cutoff for that guy, I think, is the same. Not sure, but yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, for both of these, February 1st, 2011. What we're going to be looking at today, though, is specifically this 2013 already has these upgrades. And the problem is oil getting past the piston rings, and what can you do to free up the piston rings? Now this vehicle also already has the AFM shield. That was what I was trying to mention. And so what this is going to be about today is just jumping straight down to this procedure down here. So what they're talking about here is attempting to chemically break up the carbon around the piston rings. And we're going to combine this with a more modern chemical treatment as well. This is from 2014. This is all they really had. So what they tell you is to pull the plugs, make sure that none of the pistons are at TDC, and clean the pistons. Clean the piston. They say pistons, but I'm going to say pistons and piston rings by putting in 4 to 5 ounces of upper engine and fuel injection cleaner, GM 8886 1803. Now this part number is discontinued, but it's been superseded. I'll show you the new current part number. You put that in each cylinder and you allow it to soak for between 2.5 and 3 hours, but not more than 3 hours, and then you remove it. And the most obvious way to get it out of there is cranking the engine over. You're going to want to pull the ignition coil and fuel injector harnesses before cranking it over. This is a volatile chemical, and it can atomize as you push it out, so you definitely don't want anything sparking. And then we're going to need to put some tarp around the painted areas, because this stuff is strong enough to damage the finish. Now we're not going to remove the oil pan, because that's the part about installing this active fuel management shield. We already have that on a 2013. They're simply continuing in the bulletin to go through what I was showing you about how you would install that if you have a vehicle where the manufacturing cutoff, it hasn't been done. And then they continue in this bulletin just to talk about doing the exact same thing, if I can get a hold of it here, on cast iron blocks. And it's actually the same exact instructions, as you can see, for what we're doing. And then after you get done, you want to make sure I didn't show this, but it's the same instructions for the aluminum. You got to make sure all this stuff is out because you could hydrolock the pistons. That's why you want to crank it over with the plugs out, get all that out of there, and then reinstall the plugs. They're suggesting if the plugs look okay, you can reuse them. I think we're just going to go with all new ones, and then you can start monitoring the oil consumption from there. And then they continue to talk about that if this doesn't fix this problem, well, then what you're going to have to do is replace the pistons and rings. And they talk about the service kit for that. 2007 to 2009 is this number, and then 2010 to 2014, which was the end of this series, is this number here, 1930-0411. So hopefully we don't have to go that route, and we'll be able to get away with just what we're going to do today. So this is the current flavor of this chemical, AC Delco Top Engine Cleaner. It's an AC Delco number 103015 and a GM 1935 5198. This is what replaced the chemical that's listed in the bulletin. Got 32 ounces here. We're going to need to do 5 per cylinder. We're going to need 40 ounces, so you end up having to get 2 cans and you have some left over, unfortunately. So let's get started. I'm going to pull all the rest of these plugs out, and then we'll come back. I'll show you adding this, and then we'll go ahead and show removing the harness connectors, and then we're going to let it sit for the 3 hours that it needs to bake in. All right, guys, these are not all the plugs. I still got 3 more to do, but I wanted to stop and show you as we start to pull these out, right? So we started with number 1, where we had a very obvious source of the P0301. If we take a look at number 7, right, it's very heavily fouled, and if we zero in on the electrode with this white background of the other one, we can see the iridium tip is gone. And so this is the source of the P307. Now, we weren't getting any code specifically on these other cylinders, but what I did notice in the scan tool, and I'll show you that next, is these 5 here all were reporting misfire history. And what we can see looking at number 5 is, again, our iridium tip is burned away. Looking at 3, our iridium tip is still here, but it is generating an occasional misfire. And if we look at cylinder 2, our iridium tip has burned away. So that's the reason for the misfires on those. So let me go show you the scan tool, and then we'll get the other 3 so we can get this chemical treatment going. All right, if we use our Tech 2 scan tool and we go down to misfire data, and we don't have the engine running, obviously, because we got these plugs out. All we want to do is look at the history. We scan down past the current and look at the history. This is what I wanted to show you all. So you can see we've got recorded history on 1, 2, 3, nothing on 4, very little bit on 5, nothing on 6, a lot on 7, nothing on 8. Right? So what's important here is that 3 is not an AFM cylinder, and neither is 5. Right? And so what you can start to see is this on the driver's side bank. When you get a lot of mileage, you start to see this problem even in the non-AFM cylinders in terms of the fouling going on because of the rings in the piston becoming seized up and not functioning properly. And we're seeing that also on the passenger side as well. All right, let's just keep going. I just want to kind of give you this little quick look. All right, we got the other 3 out. I just wanted to show you those. So if we take a look at number 4, we can see electrode is burned off. And this is similar to what we saw on cylinder 5. And then here, number 6. Number 6, the electrode is still present. And we saw in the scan tool, we're not getting any codes for misfires on 6. Here's 8. 8, the electrode is also burned off. And curiously, we're not getting any misfire history for 8, even though it's clearly ready to go. So you can see here that when this problem gets to a certain point, it doesn't necessarily have to be as bad as this to cause a misfire. And it can also be like this one, where the electrode is virtually disintegrated and it's not yet misfiring. And the reason this creates a problem is, if we look at 6 again, the gap that we're interested in is from the electrode to the iridium tip there. And when we see an example like number 8 zoomed in, the fact that iridium tip is burned off makes the gap larger. And that's what can lead to a misfire. It just hasn't done that yet on this particular cylinder, but it will. All right, let's go ahead and take a peek inside the cylinders before we add the engine cleaner. All right, guys, let's take a look inside each of these cylinders. We'll start with number 1. So there's our number 1 piston. I don't have one of these fancy cameras that'll let you swing all the way around, but at this angle, that's what we've got. But what I can do is I do have a camera on the side, and we can take a look on top with the valve train. And we can see all these oily deposits up on top with the valves and a lot of carbon. And if we move over to cylinder 3, we take that same view, right? There's our 2 valves, intake and exhaust. A lot of ash and normal carbon, but not that oily residue like we saw on cylinder 1. And if we go back to the piston view, well, so this is an example of what I'm doing this camera for, right? The piston is like right there. This is one of the ones we're going to have to crank over and get it to go down. We won't have any room to actually put the cleaner in. Let's go take a look at number 5. There's the piston down in number 5. And if I switch the view, get a look at the valve train on number 5. See one of the valves. There's the other valve. A little bit of oily residue right there. And you could have multiple problems going on here. You can also have valve seal problems with high mileage on these engines, also contributing to this oil burning. Let's take a look at number 7. If I can reach back here enough to try to use the camera, help guide me here. Really hard to see. There he is. All right. All right, this is another one where, the piston's like right there. Here's a view of the valves on number 7. See if I can twist this a little bit. Come on. There we go. So there's a lot of oily residue on number 7. It's way worse than number 1. And then again, the piston view. Don't have much of a piston view because that's the piston right there. Right as we come in the hole, he's right there. But we can see there's a lot of carbon deposits and unburnt oil deposits on top of number 7. So you can get a view for this problem, what's going on. Now what I'm going to have to do is get a long breaker bar. We're going to turn the engine down on the crankshaft bolt so that we can get these pistons all at a point where, like you saw in the service bulletin, none of them are at TDC. So there's enough capacity to pour the fluid in there to work on the piston rings. So let me go ahead and show you that. Now some of you might say, well, how come you didn't show us removing these spark plugs? Well, if you can't handle removing spark plugs, you shouldn't be attempting what we're talking about in this video. You could easily damage your engine permanently. If you don't understand about hydrolocking, if you get fluid in the cylinder and you don't properly expel it, you could bend the connecting rods and ruin the engine. Secondly, if you don't change the oil and filter after you do this job we're about to do, you could also damage the bearings in the engine. So this is not amateur night stuff. You got to know what you're doing. I'm sharing it with you, though, for those of you that do know what you're doing and might want to give it a shot. All right, guys, I've got a 24 millimeter socket on a 1/2 inch flex head here attached to the crankshaft bolt. And then over here on the camera we were using, we're just taking a peek at the number 1 cylinder. And we're just going to see if we can watch that piston come up partway. Right about to there. And so we're going to see now what number 3 and 5 looks like. And basically what we're going to do is we're just going to make sure that all of these, that the pistons are at a sufficient height, or excuse me, I should say depth, so that we can get 5 ounces of this fluid in there. If you don't adjust this, and if they're sitting close to TDC, then the fluid is just going to run out when you try to put it in. All right, guys, so the way we're going to add this cleaner, I'm going to use a paint mixing cup that should be tolerant of the solvent that this represents. And it's said between 4.5 and 5 ounces. So we're going to do 5 ounces for this one. I'm just doing number 3 here because it's easier to film. What I've got is just some clear hose running into the number 3 cylinder. I'm going to pour this solvent into the cylinder. Set that over there. Make sure it all ran in. Set this aside. Let's take a peek at what's going on. All right, so we can see, hopefully you guys can see, so this material is just pulled right down there in the piston area. Right, it's kind of tinted itself brown because of the oil deposits it's already picked up. All right, and that's just about what's going to sit in each one of these. So I'm just going to do all 7 other cylinders, and then we'll start our 3-hour clock. All right, while that stuff is percolating, let's go ahead and pull the top cover off the engine. Get this out of here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come down for each of the coils, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to come down here and disconnect the wiring harness, just like this. Trying to be gentle with it so it doesn't break. This one here I'm having trouble seeing. Come on. There we go. All right. Now we're going to go do the same thing on the passenger side. I'm not necessarily going to show you that, but like mentioned in the service manual, when we turn the engine over to blow all this solvent out, we don't want any source of sparks. All right, so now you can see we've got all 4 on the passenger side also disconnected. All right, so while we're on the passenger side, we'll go back around again. I'll show you this one on the number 4 cylinder because it's the most clear. We have to disconnect the fuel injector wiring harness now. So this little white retainer has to be pushed up. You can see there's a little tab right here, right there. It'll make a click sound, and we can push in and release the lock. So we're going to do that on all of these, and then we're going to do the same thing on the driver's side. There we go. All right. Get that out of the way. Now we can get it off. Jeez. All right. And now we've got everything ready to start it over. So we just need to continue waiting for this to percolate. Now there is one more thing we're going to do. We're going to put some plastic sheeting to protect the splash on the painted finish areas of the fender. All right, guys, we are about 2 hours into this baking process here. This is just some cheap plastic sheeting like drop cloth. Just using this to keep the solvent off the painted surfaces of the fenders and the hood area. Also covered up some of the more fragile plastics like the fuse box, just in case. You know, don't know how strong this stuff is on certain plastics. And we'll let it go a little bit longer until we get to the 3-hour mark, and then I'll show you how to expel this material. All right, guys, while we're waiting at the 2-hour mark, let's take a look at that same cylinder 3 that we looked at the beginning and see what's going on in here. If I can line up. All right, that material's still sitting in cylinder 3 just like we saw. Again, I don't have the kind of camera that's going to give me the ability to pan all the way around. Just can twist it around, but you can see most of this material is still sitting in there. Some of it, I can move the truck here, you can kind of see the level wobble when I do that, right? So as we went through this, the process that we used on the TDC was to get cylinder 1 at top dead center and then rotate the crankshaft in a clockwise direction an additional 45 to 50 degrees. And by that rotation, we've gotten them all kind of not at top dead center. With that adjustment, what I found was that we ended up having to go on cylinder 1 and cylinder 6. I knew they were going to be high. So I started off with 2-3 ounces. I didn't want to do the whole 5 because it was going to overflow. So I'll just give you that warning with that process. You're going to have 1 and 6 where you have to go a little less. The instructions did say between 4 and 5 ounces, so if you get close to 4, you're going to be okay with this treatment. Now, while this is sitting for 3 hours, some of this stuff is going to get past the piston rings and into the crankcase. So it's very, very important after we get this stuff expunged to do an oil and filter change. So that's another part of what we're doing. Now let me go ahead and show you what we're going to do for the second part of this chemical treatment. All right, going back to that service bulletin again. So after you do this treatment back in the day, you know, they would have said to monitor the oil consumption and see if you've gotten it back down to that 1 quart and 2,000 mile amount that for this engine, General Motors Engineering says is normal oil consumption. So it has to be more than that to be abnormal. And they're saying that after we do this treatment, if you still have more than that, then they would take you to replacement of the pistons and rings. And that's where that kit I mentioned earlier would come in. There's forum posts back when this was in vogue, in the time these vehicles would have been under warranty, where people had what we're doing today done and it helped them. The problem is that it's just going to come back. And so it was a temporary action that even if it worked, it was going to return. It just got you past the warranty period, in my opinion. So what could you do to make it last longer? Well, I'm hoping that if this works again, that it breaks down the more serious parts of the carbon and makes it better for another product that's more modern like this. And I know you guys have seen this product before. I'm not going to focus this video on this, but there's a lot of reviews on this particular oil formulation by a lot of people that specialize on their channels in focusing on lubrication. And this particular product is demonstrated to do cleaning of pistons, piston rings, and other internal engine components. In fact, they make a point to advertise that the pistons are going to be cleaned up with regular use of this, right? They go ahead and make the claim that up to 100% with continuous use. And the footnote that they take you down to on that is with continuous use, right? So that means you can't just use it once and think it's done. It means you got to run your engine on this oil from now on. But I'm hoping that this treatment that GM would have done back in the day gets us to a point where this can manage the problem. And that's what this video is about, and we're going to come back and see how this truck is doing several months down the road. But that's the 1-2 punch chemical treatment. If this plus this doesn't get a handle on this engine eating spark plugs, then we're going to have to go the piston and ring replacement route. All right, guys, we're at the 2 hours and 25-minute mark, so we're going to start this process. Before running the engine with the starter, I'm going to manually turn it over to get the bulk of this material out to cut down on the splash. So as I borrow the engine over, at least on the driver's side here, we might be able to see some of that material getting expunged out of here. So I can hear it. Hopefully you guys can see it. I can definitely hear some cylinders on the passenger side dumping it. It just cuts down on the mess. And now I'm going to go inside, crank the engine over. That should be it. And just to be sure, I'll show you on cylinder 3 here, because this is our one we've been looking at. You can see we got most of that material out of there. So we'll go ahead and get some compressed air now and blow that out. And we'll come back after we do that. All right, now that we're done with that, we can go back through and reconnect our coil wiring harnesses. And our fuel injection wiring harnesses. This one's a little bit hard to see down here. Make sure that lock gets depressed. We'll put this guy back on his little mount. Nothing magnetic. All right, fuel injector, coil, fuel injector, coil, fuel injector, coil, fuel injector, coil. We'll go do the same thing on the passenger side, and then we can put the engine cover back on. All right, we're done with this side too. We zoom in a little bit. You can see we've got 8, we've got 6, we've got 4, and we've got 2 hiding behind the oil filler pipe here. Now we can put the engine cover back on. All right, we're going to elect to replace all 8 of the spark plugs. So we're going to be putting in a new set of GM 1941 7055 or AC Delco 41162. Those are the correct plugs for the Vortec 5.3 liter for the years that this video covers. I won't bore you with putting those in, but we'll get those put in and then we'll move on to the oil change. All right, can't really narrate when we're doing this because you don't want to breathe those fumes in. I'm going to be putting my respirator mask on to do the other 7 cylinders here, but we want to make sure that there's no fluid whatsoever left, so even after cranking the engine over, there's going to be a little bit of residual material in there, and that's what we're using compressed air to blow out. All right, one last look in number 3 before we put the spark plug in there. You can definitely see the line from where the chemical was and where it was not. No fluid left in the cylinder here, and you can also still see these volatile compounds still evaporating off. It kind of looks like, hopefully it's coming across in the film. You can just see like a smoke effect. So we're going to let that air out just for a little bit, maybe another 15 minutes. We'll put the plugs in. When you put the plugs in, they get torqued to 11 foot-pounds. All right, guys, just a real quick check here with our Tech 2 scan tool. I don't expect there to be any misfires after replacing all these plugs, but just to show you, everything's running just fine after the oil change. No misfires on any of these cylinders. Let's go ahead and go under the hood. I'll show you some last few tips and comments, and then we'll wrap it up. All right, guys, we've got this little project all wrapped up. We've got the oil changed, new filter. She started right up. I'll give you a warning that this compound, as it burns off the engine and the exhaust manifold, it's going to give a real strong smell. It's really, really strong right now. You might even see a little bit of a smoke as it initially burns off the manifold pieces. That's all normal, but it's all running nice and smooth over here. Just wanted to show you these products, right? We went with the PF48 air filter, which is a GM 1273 7086. This engine in the service manual says it takes 6 quarts. My experience though on this LC9 is it just takes a little bit over 5, like 5.25 is what ends up coming up nicely to full line on this particular engine. Others might vary. And again, we'll see how this works out. This 1-2 punch, if we get a control of the piston rings getting all carboned up with this type of engine. Some folks would say, well, why don't you just maybe disable the active fuel management? And that would have been a great idea, but only back when the vehicle was still in warranty. The damage gets done after the first 3 or 4 years, and it's just too late to do something like that now. You'd have to open it up and maybe completely remove the AFM lifter and other associated hardware and rebuild the engine. Right, so that might be an option if we end up having to go in here and do the rings. But at this point, we're done. I hope this video teaches you an option that you might have to try out. I'll answer any questions you might have down in the comments. If you found this did teach you something and you found it useful and maybe it saved you some money, I appreciate you paying it forward by hitting that like button. And as always, thanks for watching.